So this is something that you should not do. This is just a mock screenshot that's a few days old, and this is very much work in progress. And there's sort of work on how these things should look and that it's easy to navigate for researchers and whoever is using the system. And of course, there's the technology back end. If you just look at the fields there, then it's very much what you would expect from this kind of system. Some of you might know Josiah Carberry. He's a fictitious researcher in the field of psychoceramics, and he is often used, in particular by Jeff Builder from Crossref. So basically, for a profile, you have two parts, which is the personal information, which is basically the affiliation, institution, and also other identifiers, like research ID in this case, and links and keywords. So that's similar to what you saw with research ID. And then there's publications and other research outputs. And publication is the easiest one. This will be done with integration with Crossref and grants and other things that is a little bit more difficult, and not all of this will be available in October. Here you see just the flags I was talking about. So this is a paper that Josiah wasn't happy about sharing, so he marked this private, which is an interesting discussion. Can researchers hide their publications? And what to do with this? And the next screenshot is just how you would do this. So this would be a Crossref search. You would find papers and then you would just import them in the system. That's again similar to what you've seen with researcher ID and what you would expect. And that's all just basic functionality. And I hope that in a few weeks you can all use this in real, not just mock screenshots.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin, for showing us how it will look like. So we're taking questions now for the whole panel speakers, either from the floor or from Twitter. Are there any questions now for any?
Just from a direction, say 3 years, 5 years from now, we heard and we saw there is a big portion of common thread data in each of your, be it a national service or otherwise, including the researcher ID from Thomson Reuters. Is ORCID, to me it is giving an impression that ORCID is a very clever skin wrapped around all of this. 3 years from now, would it mean one of these services would supersede and exist? Or because each of them also have a very a subtle commercial component. Web of Knowledge, you subscribe and then you get researcher ID free, and then there were subscriptions being talked about in the other areas. ORCID, I presume, also has a membership going into it. So there is a commercial impact to those who want to use at some point any of this. Would ORCID overtake and make the other services redundant? Is that a very long-term objective, or is there? It's still a very gray area and
I can't speak for ORCID, but I do believe that there's a fundamental overlap, but there are big differences as well in terms of the application of those profiles. So, Martin, perhaps you can answer this, but does ORCID have a plan to start looking at co-authorships and citation networks, or is it something you're just going to keep at the publication level?
I would try to answer your question in two ways. One is you look at the ORCID board and you see organizations like Thomson Reuters and elsewhere, Scopus, and others. So it's clear that just from the at least the sort of steerage of the organization now, there is interest that ORCID is helping some, but is not building a complete solution. And I think this this author identifier workshop in London in March, there was a lot of discussion about maybe author identifier should just be a registry for a number and a name, nothing more. And all the services should be built on top. And I think this wouldn't work because no researcher would register for a number which is just a number. And what also wouldn't work is one big system for everything. So it will be somewhere in between so that you have a basic service with ISNI and ORCID, but for all the interesting things like co-authorship or maybe problems specific to your discipline or your country institute, you need something else, and ORCID is just part of the infrastructure. That makes sense for many reasons, and I don't think there's any discussion about ORCID becoming the big service that provides all kinds of functionality. I would be surprised if 5 years from now that would be the case, but just a guess.
Yeah, you need to look at what do people want to do with it. So obviously it's very necessary to have an authenticated list, and maybe for some reasons that shouldn't come from a commercial company. So there's definitely strong grounds for ORCID to be in the arena. On the other hand, what a lot of people want to do is evaluate and look at performance of publications and try and link output to outcomes, and in the end an impact on society or the economy as a whole. So what they need for that is clean data, and one way that they can get that is by this disambiguation. And I mentioned how we can batch upload for a group of researchers or a whole institution, and then I was asked about the business model, and I'll just complete my answer there. So of course it's free to upload your data, to clean it, to have it in the system, even for a large number of people. But if you want to then output that cleaned data and then use it in another system, at that point we begin to discuss a business model. So we always ask people who want to output a large amount of data, what do you want to do with it? I mean, do you want to run studies on it and sell reports, in which case we'll negotiate one way, or if you just want to have clean data in your internal system, then we'll be able to look at a different model.
I'd like to add another national perspective. No matter if we at a national Spanish level implement those unique identifiers, but we need those international initiatives. So we can make a national node to provide all the identifiers for our researchers and provide them a lot of services, but we also have to need that international services, because nowadays the publications are international. We can't center only in a national. It's the same case that in UK, or they have the identifiers, but they need these international initiatives.
Sure. I think, again, from the point of view of funders, ORCID is really ideal, because in the past, whilst the Thomson Reuters researcher ID or the Elsevier equivalent of that existed, and we knew there were very good systems, we could in no way link to those or recommend those, because those were individual commercial products. Now, for example, when we produce the portal, which will list all of the research grants and all of the research outputs from those grants that we know about, then for an individual name, we could potentially link to that person's ORCID number, and we could take them back to the ORCID service, providing we pay the money to ORCID and become full members to do that. But that's a very useful opportunity, but we could never link to a commercial organization. So I very much welcome that, but there are other issues that still need to be confronted in terms of the metadata that is associated with an individual person, because presumably there is a metadata field for institution and another one for department. That information will be very no one is checking that. I think there's a secondary job for ensuring that ORCID uses the correct spelling rather than having 4 or 5 or 6 different versions of the same university name, which will very easily happen. I don't know what, smiling, I know it's a terribly difficult task, but there must be some thought has been given to tidying up the metadata.
So maybe I can just briefly comment on this because this has surfaced in the morning. So identifiers for institutions is probably more difficult than for authors because a person is a person, but institutions change all the time. So new departments are set up or split in different parts and renamed and all this. And I think the pragmatic approach by ORCID was this is not something we can all build into this first system. So this is all free text with the little help you can have to make sure that the names are the same. But there are other initiatives that try to solve this problem, and sort of the combination of NISO, ISNI, Ringgold, they have done a lot of work in this, and I think so most likely this will be solved by somebody else, and ORCID will just work with that.
And I could just add to that, that in the UK, names is looking at individuals and organisations. So we do have unique identifiers for the UK's institutions as far as universities go. What we have balked at is the departmental level because they change so often. So no, names doesn't worry about departments, but we do worry about institutions, so we do have those covered.
I'm just going to say, at the departmental level, fortunately, there is the UK Higher Education Statistics Agency from next year will be doing a survey where each year each university must make a return showing the number of staff in each department, but also the department full name will be mapped against what they call the cost centre. So it's the old-fashioned name. So you've got chemistry, physics, biology, or whatever, the things that the departments used to be called, and a particular department will say, my department is 25% chemistry and 50% physics or whatever. But at least that will be done every year, so we will have a definitive list of department names for the first time. I don't know what happens in Spain, but it's a big challenge.
And we're at Thomson Reuters, we're trying to clean data in terms of the institution. Of course, the department name is not something that we index at all. So that's something that's free text within the Web of Knowledge. But in terms of the institution name, we've gone through nearly 3,000 of the major institutions in the world, looked at all of the address variants that we can find in Web of Science and unified them into one individual name. And you'll notice within Web of Science you can now search for organization enhanced, and that means for that institution you can it means that a lot of variants have been unified into one, and that's the unification that we're using in our evaluation products like Insights.
So related to these entities, universities, departments, and so on, and we made a good try to normalize of these fields related to entities in the CVM project, but the result was that it was impossible. We always have to allow that this data can be entered in free text. We encourage to introduce this data in a normalized ID. In fact, we have more than 16,000 entities identified, but it's never enough. There are we lack of international companies, international universities. It's almost impossible to maintain a number of problems.
Okay, what I was saying is if you are successful to do this mapping or to do this census, then you have to face the problem of classify them well, if you want to compare universities, you have to put them together, which is the easiest or the simplest group. But once you go to independent research organizations or governmental agencies, or this is a big mess, also hospitals or departments and hospital universities, hospitals. Here in Spain, this is a festival. This is crazy.
To Martin again, next month is when the launch of the first module is. What is ORCID's expectation in terms of the data quality? And then what are the numbers you are expecting? I mean, how many ORCID IDs do you think might get created in the first upload? Whatever logistics or method that you're going to use in terms of the first launch. And is ORCID setting some expectation among the user community that we need to send in clean data? Or is ORCID going to run a disambiguation offline, or whose responsibility is that?
I think there's no sort of official expectation by ORCID to say by December 2012 we expect so many ORCID identifiers. If you look at the list of launch partners, there are just, I think, 3 institutions that could create ORCIDs for their staff, but the others are just publishers and other places that would use ORCID identifiers. And I have, as I said in my talk, I don't know what the uptake by the researcher community will be, whether this will be slow or fast. I'm just realistic. I don't think it's important that after 6 months that there are 1 million people in the system, but it's more important that it grows over time. And data quality in this version is really the data that the researcher puts in there. And I think this is still the best system we have right now. So this is better than anything that's automated and so forth. And I think the sort of percentage of fraud is probably much smaller than the errors you make with automated systems or with people that really don't know the person, whether this is really the publication by this person, etc. And the data quality will increase over time when we add sort of verification by the publishers and institutions, funding organizations in the next big version. So I'm not worried too much about that.
Can I just ask Martin clarification about what he understands the publishers will be doing from the launch date? Will they start immediately in October to implement the fact that authors submitting an article should also apply for an ORCID ID? And if they're doing that, is it the main author or is it all the authors on a paper? In which case, if you're dealing with a particle physics paper with 300, 400 authors on a paper, I can see the community complaining about the time that it takes to register everybody. So what is your impression about how rigorous the publishers will be in starting to implement this?
I think the first issue there is that publishers don't do manuscript tracking systems. They have vendors that build them for them, and so they have to tell them we want this in there, and then they say, okay, that's one of many things we want to implement, and so there's delays in there. I know that there's several publishers working very hard with vendors like Scholar One and Areas on this, and this will be, let's say this will be close to October. So I know that the outreach meeting, for example, will show what they have in terms of implementation, but how long it will take where a journal decides to really implement this, there might be some delay, but I don't think this is more a few months than a year or two. And then how the journals implement this, I think that's really up to every journal, whether this is mandatory or voluntary, whether this is on submission or on acceptance. What you do, for example, maybe on submission, it's just the corresponding author and all the other authors when it's accepted, and there are many variations, and I think ORCID is sort of, we wrote a little manuscript where we sort of, that will be published in October in Learn Publishing, where we sort of wrote up some recommendations how to do that, but I think every publisher has his own ideas.
So I think this question is for you, David. Where do you think that ORCID should be, when the researchers should be asked to get an ORCID? I mean, when they submit the CV in our own records, in our own quiz system, maybe when they are uploading documents into our repository, or in which step do you think that they will need to be asked to get an ORCID?
I think the ORCID must be generated maybe as soon as possible. So, as Martin has said, a university can batch, or with the permission of the researcher, generate all those identifiers. So, from my point of view, this has to be made as soon as possible. And as far as if you have those identifiers, then the library and all that systems that can use identifiers, but they cannot generate it. If the university has generated, then can use it. So the university have a lot of entries, a lot of profiles of their researchers, and the message, from my point of view, is generated as now. There is no place in the. There is no reason because you have to wait for a certain event to generate that identifier.
So maybe we need to ask them one step back, right? I mean, maybe when they just are being hired at the university.
If you are hired from, if you are young and you haven't worked in a university before, when you become a researcher, it's a good time to generate your researcher ID. Yes, it's my opinion.
And now I have another question to Martin, maybe. Once the service is being launched in October, I bet it will be like a big hit, right? I mean, the service is live. So any researcher will be able to register into the system. So what they're going to do, I mean, people at my university, they will get an ORCID for what? If there is still no publisher who's going to ask in the submission tracking period, or if my quiz system is not going to ask him to put the ORCID, it will be like, okay, we have 1,000 authors registered in the system, so what?
Yeah, but I think that's really this chicken and egg problem, what I mentioned earlier, that you have to start somewhere, and I think the best place is really the manuscript submission systems. And I don't know the exact schedule for that, but I expect that several major publishers will implement this in the next few months, and that at that time many researchers will be asked to implement an ORCID ID. And then there are other people that just like to, who use researcher ID and similar services now, who just like to have a list of their publications and then export this to their academic webpage, etc. So I think the launch is really just the first step, and that maybe 6 months from now this will look very different from what you can do with ORCIDs. You also saw that the list of launch partners, there are also some smaller partners that might be working faster of building interesting services around ORCID IDs. So for example, there was Total Impact and Figshare, which is just services where you can do interesting things once you have done this. So for example, collect all the citations for your papers. You can do Scopus and Web of Science, but you can also use one of these services.
You mentioned before the ID for institutions. And you mentioned also before the ISNI. ISNI is International Standard Name Identifiers. You're going to work with them the same way you're working with researcher ID? I mean, once you get your ISNI, you will synchronize it with it the same way with the others, or?
This is a little more complicated because the short answer is yes, but the longer answer is that right now you will have two different numbers, so an ISNI and an ORCID, similar to have a research ID and an ORCID ID, and you can synchronize this. And the idea that sort of every ORCID automatically is an ISNI, was too complicated for the beginning. So the numbers look the same, it's the same 16 digits, and ISNIs, you can have ISNIs for Brad Pitt and Barbie and whatever, so this is a much broader scope. This is not just science, but to coordinate this has been too difficult, and projects like Odin, that's what we were working on, that this becomes easier over time. So right now this is just one other identifier and you can link them together, just like researcher ID and many other services.
I have a question of my own. From previous ORCID presentations, it looked like the key stakeholders for its implementation would be first the funders, then the publishers. But then from the discussion today, it looks like researchers themselves might be the key stakeholders, since it's mainly due to this disambiguation, duplicate ORCIDs for researchers coming from parallel strategies for implementation, say institutional, individual. There's hardly a way a researcher can submit his/her ORCID ID to a publisher if there are several of them at the same time, isn't it? So it's probably about getting the word spread to researchers, to authors, individual ones, to keep track of how many author IDs, how many ORCIDs they may have at a certain point, and then becoming involved in this manuscript submission process attached to ORCID and for the funders as well, isn't it?
Well, I guess my answer would be that, well, two short answers. One is ORCID is a big organization with many different views, and that's good. And the funder and the publisher and a librarian and a researcher and a commercial company, they all have different views on the same problem. So you hear different opinions, and sort of we try to work together. And I think for the most part, ORCID has really worked with all these organizations and not so much with the researcher, because before the service is launched, the researcher cannot really do much. And I think that's why it was in my presentation, is a big question mark what researchers will do. So will this be something that researchers like to use and there will be big uptake? Then that's basically a system where researchers sign up and others use these numbers. Or is it something where the universities and the publishers and the funders really have to push the researchers to really use these numbers? And that's probably, we can all guess. I'm interested in your opinions, but I don't think we really know that. And I think most people are more pessimistic than me about what researchers will do.
For myself, speaking just as organizer, we've had already 5 sessions like this one. This is the 5th one. It's mainly about the research information management community discussing several issues with themselves. I mean, I haven't seen many researchers attending these sessions, which is normal. They have many other things to do. I'd like to ask both Jerry and Amanda, from your experience in the UK, I mean, there are several processes, RIM-related processes, research information management, that are being carried out which are more independent from researchers than this one. I mean, we can deal with research outputs, we can deal with loads of processes in there without researchers becoming personally involved in that information management. I don't think it's the case for this one, though. I'd like to know your view on that.
From the names point of view, we haven't done the same as ORCID in that we haven't made researchers claim their identifiers. So we've mostly gathered the information from elsewhere, publicly available information about the researchers' outputs. So if you like, they haven't got that stamp of approval from the researcher themselves, because we wanted to have a certain amount of data in the system, and if we were relying on the individual researchers to put data in, we didn't think we would get there. So using the RAE data was great because that gave us a fifth of, as I find out today, a fifth of UK researchers are now in the system, and they're the most prominent researchers as well. So it's a good starting point, and then we can look at other sources of information, including the researchers themselves. We put the submission form up about 6 months ago, but we haven't promoted it at all, and it's not been used very much. But then we haven't got the profile that ORCID has, so I don't think it'll be the same for ORCID. But I think we need to have a hybrid approach, and that's what NAMES is. I meant to say that in my presentation. It's very much a hybrid of the library approach and the publisher approach to doing things. So hopefully you get the best of both worlds, a certain amount of data, and then the researchers saying, yes, that's me, no, that's not me, and sorting out the problems of disambiguation. So I think you need a two-pronged approach for that. Yeah.
Very good question. I don't know all the answers. The funders certainly can do quite a lot potentially, but the universities, of course, are very resistant to more bureaucracy all the time. But we have a system, for example, before any academic can submit a research proposal, they must be registered within our grant system. So as well as having a unique identifier which identifies him or her with the Research Council, we could potentially ask them optionally to include the ORCID number. That may be one option. Also, there are the two portals that I mentioned, the research output system and the other eval system. Clearly, it would be useful to ask them to insert an ORCID number there, but it's 16 digits. It's a lot of numbers to ask anybody to manually insert. The other mechanism we could do is when we suck information from Scopus and from Web of Science, perhaps because it's been referred to within the acknowledgement section of the paper, then it may be worthwhile sucking any information that is held in researcher ID or the Scopus equivalent, so we can import the ID in that way. Anything to reduce the number of times that number has to be manually inserted by a given researcher would be good. So I don't know. I will have to think about it. But the other thing I do think it's worth mentioning is that it is very difficult often to track students. So when we're talking about the first employment of a researcher, and that's when they should get their ORCID ID, I would put it much earlier than that. I would say the first time that a PhD student starts their grant, that as part of the process of initiating their PhD, that they should be asked to apply for an ORCID ID then.
Jerry, could I ask you, you said before you couldn't really realistically ask researchers to submit a researcher ID because Thomson Reuters is a commercial provider. Why not? It's free.
Yeah, but we would have to ask them to provide the Scopus ID and ask the ProQuest ID and all the other organizations that hold different IDs. We would have to be seen to be being fair.
But you can put any publication into Researcher ID, not just Thomson Reuters ones. So it's free, you can get everything in. Where's the problem?
Yeah. politics. But asking them to enter the ORCID ID is fine. That gets over the politics problem because it has no commercial implication. And I'm very encouraged by what you said earlier on about institutions being able to pre-register all of their staff and then get the staff to do that. I see that mechanism and Elsevier's similar mechanism as one of the ways that ORCID will be populated very rapidly, because the added value available from researcher ID is significantly more than the added value in ORCID at the moment. So it's great. I enjoyed your presentation. I will come to you very soon with a list of 3,000 employees who want researcher IDs, I think.
Okay, great.
Yep.
I have yet another question for Martin. I mean, ORCID seems like a huge challenge to push ahead. Could you briefly explain what the organization, I mean, so far as I understand, the work has been carried out by a group of people affiliated with different universities, research centers, organizations that have been devoting their time to ORCID on a non-fee basis, on a non-professional, I don't know how to, they're not being paid for that. So it's a great accomplishment so far, taking into account that ORCID is not actually hiring you, but that should probably change in the future if it becomes a large, successful initiative. Could you briefly tell us what the perspectives are for that?
I can say that as of now, ORCID has a board with 14 members, has 4 different working groups, and this is all voluntary work. ORCID has a staff of 2. So one executive director, Laura Haag, who started in April, and a technical director, Laura Paglione, who started in June. And ORCID will be hiring 2 more technical people in the next few months and probably a few more staff, but this will be a small organization because one problem is that this costs money and you don't want to build a big organization and have memberships fees that are much, much higher. So I think this will always be fairly small, so I would be surprised if more than 10 people work for ORCID in a few years. And so this, in other words, means this always depends on voluntary work and always depends on ORCID not doing everything. And I think that's fine. The ODIN project will have 1 additional person, I forgot that, and I will be working in part, so getting paid in part of the ODIN project starting next few weeks.
So are there any further questions? Because otherwise I'd like to briefly go into this Finch report argument, or Gerald Lawson briefly telling us whether he personally thinks RCUK betrayed the green open access movement, the open access movement as such, by endorsing the Finch reports. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
No, okay, interesting question. I think if the green open access movement over the past 10 years had got itself organized and had populated information into repositories in sufficient volume that either the postprint or the preprint was actually in repositories consistently, then there would be an argument. But to my mind, I'm afraid, with some very outstanding exceptions, most repositories are very badly populated, both in terms of the full content and often in terms even of the metadata of the publications produced by their staff. So I think we have to confront reality, and reality is that open access is what we want to see. And that probably the best way of encouraging that is to have an emphasis on gold open access, which means that we need to recognize the real work which is done by publishers and work with publishers to give them due compensation for that, and recognize that a payment is involved and that's part of the research process. So we need to recognize, certainly in the UK, we do recognize that if we bring out well, as we have done, we bring out a new policy policy that says from the 1st of April 2013 that all publications must be either gold open access or green with a restricted embargo period. Then that means that we are expecting the universities to pay a lot of money that they don't have in their existing budgets for. So therefore, the funders together recognise, as for example the Wellcome Trust in the UK has done for a number of years, that an additional payment is necessary, and we will make such a payment. We haven't announced the details of that payment, but it will be in some way proportional to the staff time or the cost of staff working on research projects. So we'll look at the cost of that over the past 3-year period and proportionately give that money to different universities. We will expect that the university to manage that budget completely independently. It's totally for them to decide how to spend it and how to allocate between grant holders. That we don't assume that only the grant holders will get that money. But we do expect that the universities will be able to report in some way. Probably it will not be a regular annual report, but it'll just be a capacity. If we ask a question, how did you spend this money, then they will be able to answer us that. So therefore there is a need to work together on metadata associated with grants and metadata associated with two things. The metadata associated with who funded the research in the first place, and the metadata associated with who paid for the article processing charge. Now that doesn't need to be part of the metadata held in the repository, but the university should have that somewhere within their CRIS system, because we need, the universities and the funders need in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, we need to look at the total amount of money that is being paid for open access payments versus the total amount of money that is being paid for subscriptions, and we need to go back to the publishers and say, we know that you, publisher Elsevier, are getting this amount of money from the universities. We see your average subscription charges and we don't see them decreasing. Therefore, why not? Is the answer, because we give you this money. So a lot of it can be done using the market, but there will be a conflict with researchers. A researcher will say, I want to continue to publish in science. Well, science is okay because it's open access, but nature is more a problem. I want to continue to publish in nature, and nature at the moment, 6 months today, nature needs to bring its embargo period down. I don't know if they've got a green option. So who knows? They do have a green option. Is it 6 months embargo though, or is it 12 months? I think there may be a negotiation over the embargo period needed. And there is a negotiation, as I say, over the copyright license, whether it's, as Stefan Harnad calls it, gratis or free or whatever. I mean, essentially it's whether you're allowed to do data mining of the information, because even in UK, even in PubMed Central, even though there is a deposit of the paper there, I think more than half of the paper's data mining is not allowed on those. So I think the funders consider that ridiculous. If an academic has done the research, if a funding organisation has paid for the research, we will certainly compensate the publishers for the time that they spend putting that paper into their journals, but there is no way that the publisher should own the copyright on that publication. That should remain with the academic, remain with the university. So that is something that we're fighting hard with them. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Just briefly comment, the fact that the Finch report and later on RCUK and the UK government have advocated for gold open access doesn't necessarily mean that green is dead. It could also be seen as an opportunity for open access repositories to enhance their metadata, to collect a higher number of full text in there, to clear up the embargo policy, and to become fit to deliver, right?
Yeah, surely. This is not undermining or undervaluing the role of institutional repositories. We still see those as very important, both as a showcase for the publications produced by a given university, but also as a mechanism of providing access to the full text of non-peer-reviewed papers, which remain very important, but also potentially of providing links to the added value coming out of those papers. So repositories are becoming more and more important to store metadata about data sets that derive from publications. And that's one of the areas which, again, we're still debating, because many of the publishers are introducing data journals. And those data journals cost money, and they will expect an article processing charge as well if they're reviewed. So there is a risk that yes, much more data and supporting evidence is needed for each paper, but we don't want to see that as a mechanism. Well, I say I don't think we have an RCUK position on this. I think repositories could be much more prominent in providing links between publications and supporting data. Because if repositories don't do that, the publishers will do it, and the publishers will ask you for more money to get access to your own data.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really useful. Any further questions? Because I think otherwise we can close now. The session, it's over 2:30. I think Anna told us it's a little too late, our finishing time for having lunch at the university. She mentioned Cosmocascia is right around the corner. Thank you very much. Thank you all speakers. Thank you for attending. I think it was really useful, the session today, and I hope ORCID is a real success soon.